Have you struggled to run in the heat? Do you have an upcoming race that will be run in hot conditions? Would you like to know how better to acclimate your body for running in the heat? Welcome to episode 229 on the Healthy Runner podcast, where we help you get stronger, run faster, and enjoy lifelong injury-free running. Today, my guest is Dr. Mani Alavi, who is a true expert when it comes to running in the heat. He is an emergency medicine physician, former attorney, and avid runner. He's veteran of multiple world major events, including veteran of the Boston Marathon and the hotter than normal conditions that we had here in 2024. Dr. Alavi's area of focus is in heat science, with a special focus area on heat acclimation and training. When not practicing medicine or running, he is the host of the Adaptation by Fire podcast, where they discuss health, fitness, and how to optimize performance under extreme conditions with other hosts and leaders in the field. Dr. Alavi also writes on these topics, and in his free time, he likes to spend time with his family, coaching his kids' soccer teams, traveling, and spending time outdoors. Dr. Alavi, you've accomplished a lot. You are a true expert in this field. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. Welcome to the Healthy Runner podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Duane. Well, first of all, thank you for that introduction. That you make me sound a lot better than I am. Thank you for the invite, man. You do some really great work. I went back and listened to some of your stuff. I love your content. You know, you help people stay healthy, run fast, all good stuff. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And yeah, I'm excited to have you here. And, just to kind of let some of our listeners know, where do you call home, and give us a little backstory on really how you've gotten to this point in your career journey.
Yeah, so I call Dallas, Texas home. Not the coldest place in the world. I've always been kind of crazy. When did I start running? I probably started running as a child. Kind of like Forrest Gump. I started running one day and I couldn't stop, and I just kept always training. I guess my running background is I ran fairly competitively in high school. I also played American football, and truthfully, for lack of a better term, I just never stopped. I'm middle-aged now. I think I'm your age. Well, actually, I don't think you're middle-aged. I'm middle-aged. I think 45 is when middle-age starts. So I've always just kind of continued running. Initially I would run 5,000 meters. We would run these 2-mile races. And then over time, you just kind of, adapt and go for longer distances. I love them all. I love all distances. But I try to run, 4 to 5 marathons a year. I have a lot of affection for the Boston Marathon. I try to do that one every year. And like you said, I'm very interested in heat science. That's kind of my area of passion. I write on these topics. I think that there's a lot of advantages for people to become heat acclimated. Like you mentioned, I'm a full-time practicing ER physician when I'm not doing all of these other things, and I have kiddos, and it's just been a great journey, man. Running has been so good to me. So that's kind of my story, and I'll stick with it.
No, thanks for sharing. And definitely, with obviously your professional background, you're like literally saving people's lives. So I'm really excited to talk about today's topic, because I know this is an area that can be dangerous, right? You see lots of runners at races, needing to go to the med tent, a lot of people kind of, really redlining, and it becomes unsafe. And so, your perspective is definitely going to be a unique one. And it sounds like you've put into practice lots of this into your own training. So it's not just the theoretical, model and heat adaptation and acclimation, but it sounds like, you've been actually implementing some of these principles I'm sure we'll talk about into your daily training. And I know you just completed Boston, so congratulations. And
yeah,
you mind just sharing a little bit of a recap, or how that event went?
Yeah. So, all week, we all obsessively look at the temperature, and the temperatures were reasonably okay. It was supposed to be in the, mid to low 50s, if I remember correctly, at dew point in the 40s. It was supposed to be reasonably good good weather. Last year, of course, it rained. That was kind of the rainy, but it was cloudy and it was actually pretty ideal. This year, it was supposed to be sunny. So that's a little negative, but overall, the air temperature. And as it got closer to the race, I remember people just noticing it was getting warmer and warmer. That morning, if I remember correctly, was probably air temperature wise in the lower 60s, mid 60s, dew point of mid 50s. But there was this radiant heat, which is the sun, of course, and Massachusetts that time of year. And you live in Connecticut, is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm like
Okay,
2 hours away from Boston.
so very, there's not a lot of leaves out there that time
No.
of year. So not a lot of shade. And then it turned out to be a pretty warm day. My race recap, honestly, Duane, is I woke up, got a couple of messages going, "Hey, you better not bonk because you always talk about the heat." So I was like, "Okay, I better try to not blow up today." I got pretty lucky. I was able to kind of hit the metrics I wanted. I got to the halfway point around a little bit, around 131-ish, 130-ish. You're going downhill in the first half. I felt fairly comfortable. And then,
That's that first half plan, by the way?
That was my first, obviously my goal with Boston is to qualify again for next year. And now that I'm in the 45 category, I have a little bit more of a cushion. So, that's kind of my number one goal. My number two goal is not to embarrass myself. And number three goal is, to sometimes do a sub 3. That's kind of usually my top 3 goals, if that makes any sense. So, so we got to mile 16 or so, and that's when the hills start. 16 is actually downhill, then 17 to 21 is when the hills start. And then you're cooking there. You are getting a decent amount of sun. You're getting maybe a decent amount of, I should say, lack of wind at that point. And, there's usually a lot of carnage at the Boston Marathon. I used to, train there. I trained there and I lived there for a while. I used to go watch it even when I was not running it. And usually, the last 10 kilometers of the Boston Marathon, there is a lot of people walking. But I had never seen anything like this before. And I think it was just probably the temperature. But yeah, I got through that. And man, I was in a low point in mile 21. But once I hit Cleveland Circle, as you probably know where that is, mile 22, I started running again. And I was pretty happy with my performance. So it was pretty fun. It's nothing like it.
Nice. So you didn't totally blow up, and you were able to kind of get through. And it sounds like you finished pretty much like marathon pace, right? Like those last 5 or 6 miles. I heard you mention on your show.
Yeah, I got pretty close to marathon pace at the last 4 or 5
That's
miles.
fantastic.
I did 3:06, which I'll take. 3:06:58, but I'm gonna say 3:06.
There you go.
But someone was telling me, a lot of people lost a lot of time, so I'm pretty happy with my performance. But yeah, I mean, it's always a pretty challenging course. It's also the season, it's a spring race. So most of us are training in the winter months. Even in Dallas, it's not very warm when we're training. So we're not really acclimated to the heat unless we actively try to acclimate. So I think that's the challenge. And we can talk about all of these great topics and our fatigue resistance when it comes to heat acclimation and all that stuff. But I think it was just one of those days where it was just a little bit warmer than usual. And we're generally not very acclimated at that point in the season. So, but
Yeah, no, it affected lots of runners, and we had some athletes who were running it, and definitely were impacted by that heat. And so, how does temperature really affect running performance? And what can runners do to mitigate some of those negative impacts?
Yeah, man, you're talking all my love languages here. Yeah. So, well, first of all, I like your opening statement. We've all experienced those difficult races, right? We're training 14, 16 weeks for these races. And the marathon gods are sometimes not very friendly to us. And it turns out to be a really warm day. And you feel like, all that time, all that effort was sort of wasted in your mind because you are just so fatigued at the end of the race. And that is very normal. It happens to all of us. We all will lose a little bit of time. But here's the good news, Duane, is that as humans, we can really remarkably adapt to the heat. And not to get too philosophical about this, but just from a human perspective, I'm a physician by trade. So I have a lot of curiosity and interest in just the human condition in general. But as humans, man, I can tell you, there's never been a creature who can adapt to the heat and persevere and do endurance activities in the heat like humans can. I don't know if you've heard the term perseverance hunting, but the idea is that, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans, we would, as pack animals, go out in the hottest part of the day and just exhaust these quadrupeds. And how do we do that? Because we can thermoregulate, and I only say all this is because I want us to just appreciate the fact that we can all become really well acclimated to the heat. Birds fly, fish swim, we thermoregulate, we sweat, and that's kind of our environmental niche. So I guess to answer your questions, what can runners do to mitigate these negative effects, to not be in a situation where you're just dreading this race because it's 10 degrees warmer or the dew point's a little bit higher, is we can become acclimated to the heat. There's all of these mitigation strategies that we can dive deep a little bit into today. But basically what we're trying to do is adapt and acclimate to the heat and essentially do what we do, which is thermoregulate.
Yeah, and I like how you talked about like the persistence hunting. Because I had Jeff Galloway, the father of the run, walk, run method, or the king, I should say. And he talked about that and how we used to use essentially a walk, run, a walk method, run, walk, run method to hunt. And I like how that you're kind of bringing in the fact of we were doing that in these like terribly hot conditions, and we were able to acclimate to those conditions. And right, like the difference from what I understand about like us and the quadruped, other animals is like the ability to sweat, right? Like we have sweat glands that are a little different than some of our animal counterparts. And yeah, I guess going to that point and just kind of the basics.
And Duane, sorry to interrupt you, but there's actually these races in Scotland, I believe, where it's man versus horse. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I've heard of that. Yes, I've read about that.
And what's interesting, what you said was absolutely correct. Most animals don't sweat, but actually horses are one of the few animals that sweat a little bit. They're not as efficient as sweating and thermoregulating as we are. But the point of this is that when the temperatures are above a certain degree, the human always wins. And these are not extremely fast marathons. Sometimes the winner's like 3:20, 3:25, which is a great time, but these are not like, 2:10 marathoners. And the horse will always lose. So back to your point, absolutely. This is what we do. I don't want to be hyperbolic and say this is the only thing we do as humans. We do many, many other things. We communicate. We're, social loving creatures, all of these things. But our physical niche is endurance activities in the hottest part of the day. And essentially no other carnivore would come out during that time. And these quadrupeds have to pant by cooling, and we can sweat. And that's such a big advantage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just like looking at, and what I've kind of learned over the years of my running journey is to not only look at like, my weather app and look at temperature, but to also look at humidity and dew point. And can you just explain just some of the basics on like what's the difference between humidity and dew point, and then how that really affects running performance?
Yes, absolutely. I'm laughing because a few weeks ago we got invited to a dinner party, and I have a buddy of mine there who's a bigger weather nerd than me. And my wife, before the party, says, "Please do not talk about the dew point." Please do not talk about the dew point. No one cares about the dew point. And so I'm not going to bore your audience to death. But I will just tell you this. So the only thing I kind of want people to know is, I mean, if we want to define these things, I mean, humidity basically refers to the amount of water vapor, moisture. It's reported in a percentage. We've all seen that, like 70 degrees Fahrenheit with 60% humidity. Okay, what does that mean? Dew point indicates the temperature at which air becomes saturated with moisture or dew. And I think it provides a much clearer measure of how humid something is, and the impact on performance. So, for instance, just as an example, dew point is reported in a temperature, correct? So if I told you, Duane, that the air temperature is 70 degrees Fahrenheit, is that good running weather? Maybe, maybe not. If I told you the relative percentage humidity is 60%, is that good running weather? Who knows? I mean, if it's 40 degrees Fahrenheit, could be perfect running weather. But if I told you the dew point is 70 without any other 70 degrees Fahrenheit, you would know automatically that it is not going to be a great day. It's going to be very uncomfortable, and you need to adjust your pace. So I think that's kind of the whole point of it, is that dew point is such a more accurate measure on the impact of performance of any endurance activity. Because again, how do we cool down? We sweat, and that sweat needs to evaporate. That sweat needs to dissipate. That's our cooling mechanism. That's our AC unit for our body. When a drop of sweat, for instance, hits the ground, it did not do its job. It did not cool you. So that's all that it refers to. So again, I think dew point is a lot more accurate. Thank you for asking that question. I only say this because, so if you're looking at, before a run or before a race, I think the dew point is a very important thing to pay attention to. Again, 60 degrees Fahrenheit with a dew point of 25, that is awesome weather, right? A air temperature of 65 with a dew point of 64 is not great. So again, it's a subtle thing, but it can make a huge difference, because we essentially won't be able to efficiently cool ourselves when the dew point is really high. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that is absolutely, I think, a very kind of a crucial point. But yeah, I'm not sure why the weather report is reported in humidity. I think it's probably just tradition and simplicity and familiarity. But right. Or maybe they think we might get confused. Maybe if they say the air temperature is 70 with a dew point of 25, maybe they're worried that Monty's going to go out with his winter clothes and overheat or something. I don't know. We're actually having a meteorologist come on the show, so I'm going to ask him that question.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that'd be interesting to hear. And so, if I'm understanding you correctly, is our bodies sweat to essentially cool down our core temperature, right? So it's like a protective mechanism in why we sweat. And that sweat, when it goes on our skin, needs to be evaporated by the air. But if there's too much moisture in the air, so the dew point's high, then that sweat can't evaporate. And like you mentioned, it will just literally fall to the ground because it doesn't evaporate. So then it didn't cool the skin. It didn't cool the body at all. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. This is how we cool ourselves. This is our AC unit. And if it's not working properly because it's not able to evaporate, then that's when we have that muggy feeling. That's when we feel horrible. And again, just dew point is a little bit more of an accurate measure of humidity. And then just another aside, the dew point can never be higher than the air temperature. That's just impossible. So that is, I think, why it's important to kind of gauge the difference between relative humidity percentage and dew point. So yeah, and there's all these charts, Duane. And a lot of them are really good. Basically, I mean, just off the top of my head, anything a dew point above 60 does not feel great. A dew point above 70, that's pretty oppressive, sort of running conditions. Anything below 45, even 50, I think is pretty comfortable dew point wise. even if it's 70 degrees with a dew point of, again, 40, that's not bad. You can really cool yourself, especially if you're a little acclimated.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the big education points we always make with our athletes every season. Usually that summer season, And I will definitely link our chart to the blog post that we'll put together with this episode. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, watching the YouTube video version, if you click on the blog, you'll be able to see that chart. It's a nice thing to save. Honestly, I have it in my favorites on my phone because even I forget the number sometimes and how to adjust effort level with the running that you're doing if that dew point is high, because it definitely is a difference maker. So that will be super helpful. So yeah, now I'm kind of interested to know, as we all kind of think about, getting into heat of summer and summer's coming, really, what is heat acclimation and why is it important for running?
Yeah. So to answer your question, so heat acclimation basically involves physiological changes that help your body cope with heat stress. We call that heat stress or heat load. And what happens physiologically is that first of all, your body, your core body temperatures at a lower level at baseline once you become acclimated. Your plasma volume changes, and then we can talk about the importance of that in a second. Other things that happen is you have a reduced heart rate at a given effort. And other important things are increased sweat rate. So you're sweating more and you're sweating earlier. And you'll have more dilute sweat the more acclimated you are. And again, the benefits are improved performance in hot conditions. And we think actually improved performance in temperate conditions too. There's some literature that supports that idea as well. But certainly you're going to have improved performance in hot conditions. And then of course, so I'm a physician by trade. All the disclaimers, none of this is meant to diagnose or treat any illnesses. And certainly, heat related illnesses are a real thing. Heat stroke is a real thing. All of these things are, based on my opinion. So I want everyone to kind of just be aware of that and talk to their providers, because everyone's, underlying health conditions will prevent them from doing certain things. But in general, for a given person, this is what we expect. And some of the, I think you might be asking yourselves, why do we have an improved performance? Of course, we're going to keep our core body temperature lower, which is important, again, by the increased sweat rate and sweating earlier. But there's also this thing, Duane, it's called the cardiac output. It's basically how much volume of blood your heart will pump at a during exercise or at rest, and it's usually reported in liters per minute. And the components of cardiac output are heart rate and stroke volume. And so what we understand is that when our plasma volume goes up, our stroke volumes increase. Therefore, our cardiac efficiency and cardiac output is increased. So I don't know if that answers your question. I know there's a lot of terms and definitions there. I'm happy to repeat some of that.
Yeah, no. So is heat acclimation, does that like naturally occur in all of us as like the weather gets warmer, you run in more humid conditions with higher dew points? Like, is that a natural process that actually occurs in most of us?
It happens in all of us. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, heat acclimation will happen in, it's a physiological change that your body will adapt to. Of course, there's things that may limit that. But in general, absolutely, we can all become acclimated to the heat. And again, one of the biggest factors is that plasma volume change. So just to back up a little bit, the components of your blood are your plasma volume, your red blood cells, and your other cells like your white blood cells. And plasma volume is usually about 55% of the blood content. And what we know is that when you become more heat acclimated, your plasma volume will go up. And so the liquid portion of your blood will go up. And again, it will translate into a higher stroke volume and a higher cardiac output. So,
Okay, so if it was, let's say, too hot conditions, let's say you weren't heat acclimated, let's say you ran the Boston Marathon and you've been training in 30-degree weather this whole marathon training cycle, and you get to those hills and it's 70 degrees and the
Hmm.
sun's just like sizzling. Does your blood volume actually get like thicker? So like the plasma would be decreased and basically the blood is thicker, so then it requires more stress to the heart and the heart has to increase the heart rate to get the cardiac output.
Well, yeah. So your heart rate's going to go up at a higher rate than someone who's not acclimated. What will happen is that your core body temperature will reach this critical sort of threshold at a slower time. So basically, let's say two people with the same fitness, let's say they're 3 hour marathoners. One of them might lose 3 minutes, 4 minutes on a hot day. The other one might lose 20, 25 minutes. And I'm telling you, they're the same fitness level. If it's 40 degrees, they're they're finishing together. They're high-fiving each other at the end, except now one of them is going to be in a really good spirits at the end of the race. The other one is going to feel like they just wasted 16 weeks of their lives. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah.
That's the difference. And man, I asked people who are the Boston Marathon. A lot of people lost 15, 20 minutes, and these are not bad runners. These are great runners. I mean, these are the fittest people on the planet, except they were just not as acclimated as some other people.
Right.
That's just the big difference, and there's a lot of psychological impact from that as well. When you're running the Boston Marathon, and you see all these fit people walking, and it's just so disheartening for them. While when you're passing them, you're getting these little dopamine hits. So there's definitely a psychological effect from that being acclimated to the heat as well. Not to mention that when you see hot temperature, you have been there before, so you have this frame of reference, and you can from a psychological perspective can probably handle it a little bit better too.
Okay. Yeah. And so fitness level is kind of one thing. And I guess if fitness level was the same, or it could even be different, does BMI affect how someone can tolerate the heat? Like, because we have
Yeah,
runners of all shapes and
sure.
sizes, right, that are out there doing their thing and listening to this podcast. Is that a factor that you'd want to take into account if someone was going to implement some of the strategies that we're going to talk about?
Yeah, certainly, but I don't want people to think if they have higher BMI, they cannot become acclimated. Again, if you're a human being, if you're a Homo sapien, you can become acclimated to the heat. But yeah, you're absolutely right. BMI can affect it. Higher BMIs, adipose tissue is an insulator. It's less efficient in terms of sweating. You're also producing more heat with a higher BMI. But again, I don't want people to get discouraged and say I have a certain BMI and I can't get acclimated. Absolutely, everyone can get acclimated. Even the same folks with the same BMI, one can be very acclimated to the heat and the other one not. So it is a factor. I would say certainly a factor in starting out a program. But just be aware that again, all humans can become really well acclimated to the heat.
Yeah, so it sounds like even maybe taking a little bit more of a conservative approach
Yeah.
to, okay, all right.
And
Perfect.
especially a history of heat acclimation is a factor. Age is a factor. Comorbidities is a factor. All of those things are factors to think about before starting a program like this. And again, heat-related injuries and heat stroke are real things. So you want to be very conservative. So I agree with you there.
Yeah, so I guess since you kind of mentioned heat stroke, and what are some safety precautions that should be considered before really trying any type of heat training sessions?
Yeah. So obviously, gradual exposure. You want to start with shorter sessions and just gradually increase the duration and intensity. Hydration is very important. And Duane, I've heard this, in some other programs and so forth, that the more acclimated we become, the less hydration we need. That is absolutely false. That is, in
Hmm.
fact, the more, again, what we talked about a little bit earlier was that the more acclimated you are to the heat, you become a sweating machine, right? You are really efficient at sweating, and your core body temperature is a lower temperature, and you're just ready to sweat. So if anything, we need more hydration. You know, being aware, of course, and mindful of all the electrolytes we lose and so forth like that. And again, I would just say gradual exposure. You want to kind of control your environment as much as you can, and certainly look for any signs of heat related illness before you kind of dive too deep into this. But again, if you do it correctly, it actually doesn't take that much time, and you can start doing this a little bit more safely over time.
Okay, so doing gradual,
Yeah.
still hydrating doesn't mean you don't need to hydrate. And then, do you mind just mentioning what are some of those signs and symptoms of heat related illness?
Yeah, I mean, it could be anything from, you know, altered mental status to heat cramps, all the way to, you know, syncopal episodes, passing out, and so forth. The spectrum is very broad, and certainly, you know, when our core body temperature reaches a certain point, then it can potentially be life threatening. Protein denatures at a certain temperature, so heat is dangerous. But again, I would just go back to that point of hydration. You know, again, we do not become more tolerant of dehydration the more acclimated we are. In fact, our hydration needs go up. I would even say there's two things humans can never adapt to, you know, is lack of hydration and probably lack of sleep. You know, those are two things that we just don't get better at. Other things we generally do, you know, as you know, we load muscles to get them stronger. We run to build this aerobic machine. We can adapt to certain things, but lack of hydration is certainly not one of those things. So I know there's like these things called bonk runs, and I don't know if you've heard of that. People go out there without any hydration or nutrition, and somehow there's the idea that you're going to get stronger from that. I don't think
Really? Wow.
I don't think there's any evidence for any of that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying that. And then I guess just from like safety standpoint, if someone was implementing some of the strategies that we're going to talk about in a little bit, they were on a long run and it just happened to be that really hot day. If what I've heard in the past is if you stop sweating, right, that's like, you know, you definitely want to stop running, right?
Yeah, if you stop sweating, you know, if it become altered, you start cramping, you know, then you're kind of approaching heat exhaustion, and then, you know, again, the spectrum could be all the way to heat stroke. So I would definitely, you know, monitor all of those things quite. And also, I would also add, if this is the first hot exposure of the season, you want to be extra cautious, you know. The deeper we are into the summer and the hot seasons, the better we are able to tolerate those things. So, you know, if this is the first one and it's hot, I would probably that's not the time to necessarily push it. Whereas, like, you know, August, September, maybe you're pretty acclimated, and you know you might be able to tolerate it a little bit longer than you think. So it certainly depends on the season and how long you've been exposed to this.
Okay. Yeah. And how does heat training differ from like heat acclimation?
Yeah, so heat training is basically, you know, a structured exercise in heat designed to induce heat acclimation. So that's kind of the definition of heat training, I would say. And so, but heat acclimation, like you mentioned before, is just a natural adaptation process to repeated heat exposure. Of course, that can be accelerated by heat training, but heat training is a sort of a structured exercise. You're trying to get a heat load or heat stress in your body as you exercise. You can also do it passively with like sauna training and so forth. But that's kind of the two, I would say, two distinctions between the two. Essentially, the ultimate goal is heat acclimation, and you're potentially doing heat training to get better and more efficient at heat acclimatization.
Okay. And acclimatization, is that the same thing as adaptation essentially? Like when you hear people mention heat adaptation?
Essentially, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
they're just different terms, but yeah, I mean, essentially think of it the same way. Anytime your body's adapting, I mean, again, I guess we're all in the business of adapting. You're a physical therapist and a coach, and you're trying to get people adapted to certain things, right? And
Oh yeah.
so, and that's what we do as humans. We can adapt. Generally, certain stresses we can adapt to and become stronger. That's what essentially what we do in strength training or running. And this is another way of doing that, but this is related to thermoregulation and becoming more efficient at dissipating heat.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And this is where I really would like to know, and I'm sure our listeners would, what are some effective like strategies for heat training for runners?
Yeah. So I guess I don't know if this helps, but I would probably classify these as like as far as training regimens. I would probably classify it as like, are you a beginner, intermediate, or advanced? Because I don't think they would all fit for every single individual. It's got to be individualized. I would also add the caveat that you should be training for this race that you are potentially going to be exposed to. I know that's hard to predict what the weather is, but if you know it's going to be a hot, humid race, the training might be a little bit different than if you know if it's going to be a hot, dry environment. So, but I mean, as far as I guess how to do it, does that make sense, Duane? Maybe like dividing it into beginner and intermediate and
Absolutely.
advanced. Yeah. So
Yeah, so maybe start with the beginner runners. Like, what would be a recommended protocol for heat acclimation?
yeah, and I wouldn't say just beginner runners. You could be a really fast runner or a very advanced runner, but you're a beginner in heat acclimation.
Okay, thank you for that clarifying
And
point.
certainly, so what I would do again with all the safety caveats we talked about before, I would first of all for a beginner runner, I would say start slow. Begin with maybe short, less intense sessions in the heat and gradually increase it. It might not be unreasonable to do maybe 10 to 20 minutes if you have access to the heat outside. You want to be consistent, maybe 3 to 4 times a week, um, at most. And then there's also these things where you could do like a post run sauna exposure if you have exposure to a sauna. Again, please focus on proper hydration and cooling if you need if you feel like you're approaching heat illness. But I would kind of just categorize it that way. Again, it's really hard to say specifically how long you should be running. But again, I would start slow, maybe 20 minutes at first. If you can get access to a sauna after a run, that's really good because you want to keep your core body temperature higher for a duration of time. And a sauna, what it will allow you to do is you're getting less of that mechanical load, but you're still getting the same heat load. And do it, again, very conservatively 3 to 4 times a week and give that some time. And in case you're wondering the timeline on how long it takes us to become acclimated to the heat, it's pretty remarkable how short it is. 7 to 14 days, we can become fairly acclimated. 14 days is probably a more reasonable timeline. But if you think about it, Duane, for instance, if you want to, do high altitude training, it takes about 90 days to produce more hemoglobin. And this
Wow.
is, in 14 days, you can get reasonably well acclimated. So just as an aside,
Yeah, no,
uh,
that's definitely good to keep in mind, and it does matter the consistency, right? Like if someone,
sure.
and sometimes the weather is so variable, right? Like you can have a lot of times in late spring, beginning of summer, at least here in the Northeast, we'll have 2 or 3 days that are really hot, but then. So I might go on a run that's in the 70s with a dew point of 60, 65, and then I'm going to go on 3 runs after that are in 50-degree weather and, lower dew points. So if
Yeah.
that's the case, then I'm really not acclimating, right? If it is variable where the temperatures are going up and down and the dew points going up and down.
No, that's a great question. So the good news is once you become acclimated, you lose it slower than when you accumulate it. So for instance, a lot of the protocols, the heat acclimation protocols, they say induce the heat stress at least minimum of every third day. So if you go 1 or 2 days without that heat load, you're not going to lose all of it for sure. You might lose a very certain small percentage. But again, a lot of the protocols say every 2 to 3 days you should get that heat load. So I guess, the challenge is where you live is that even in the summers, you might get, maybe a week or two of cooler weather, if I'm understanding correctly. And, maybe if you can get exposure to a sauna, that would be amazing.
Hmm.
Dry saunas are what have been studied the most. I know there's infrared saunas and so forth like that. But if you can get that sauna exposure, especially a dry sauna, 20 to 30 minutes on days where you don't have access to the heat, then you're going to maintain it. You're not going to lose it. It's sort of like, again, just any other kind of load on your body. If you just, again, with strength training, if you go maybe even 2 times a week, you're not going to lose it. The same way with this, your body will keep that acclimation. So I don't have a perfect answer on if it's an extended period of time and you're only have cooler weather and you don't have exposure to sauna. Perhaps you can reproduce it, sometimes when it's cold in Dallas and I try to keep my heat acclimation, again, please don't listen to me. I have a little sauna suit and I have a way I position our treadmill at home with towels and so forth. And I crank up the heat and I try to do that. Again, probably, not practical for most people, but however you can get some heat load in you, especially if you're exercising, if you have an extended period of cool weather, that would help you maintain it.
Okay. So even going for like those treadmill runs inside of a gym that isn't really well air conditioned, right? Like that could be helpful, or even going outside and layering up essentially.
Yeah.
Obviously not too much, but just adding some layers to make sure that you are sweating early and
Yeah.
often. Is that really the goal?
Yeah, I think so. I think what you're trying to do also when you're adding layers of clothing, when you're overdressing, you're also adding a layer of humidity because you're not evaporating as well. So I think that's, again, sometimes people go with ski masks and gloves, and there's so many ways to do this. But yeah, absolutely. Adding layers of clothing when it's, maybe temperate, you're going to induce some of that heat load. Doing, those treadmill runs, like you said, inside, especially if they're not ventilated, and having extra layers of clothing. See that as an opportunity. I know it doesn't sound fun, but again, it will at least maintain your heat acclimation, if not even, you start accumulating some more of it. If again, that's the best you can do. I think, again, the challenge is some of these races, like Boston is in April, so it's not very practical for most of you guys to do that all year round, wear multiple layers. So I think that's kind of the challenge. But again, maintaining something is usually easier than acquiring it. So if you have that heat acclimation, maybe from the summer, maybe maintaining it in the fall and the winter months by doing some of these strategies you mentioned.
Right. No, that's definitely a good point because, yeah, when fall hits here, it's like, the humidity just goes away totally. And, that dew point is low, which is great. And you feel great when you're like peaking in marathon training and you're like, wow, my fitness is so good. But I could see a case to be made because
Mm-hmm.
you can get that. Heck, New York, like 2 years ago, right? You got that
Oh yeah.
extremely hot day that shocked everyone. November 1st, and
I ran that one
if
2022. That was a warm one.
yes,
Yeah. It was
yeah,
very
that was
humid too.
crazy.
Yeah.
Talking about carnage, that was a day of carnage, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was worse than Boston conditions,
Oh,
right?
for sure. It was definitely more humid, and like you said, the New York City Marathon is that first weekend in November usually, and no one's really acclimated to the heat. So that was a fun one.
But I think your point's well taken, right? If you've acquired this heat adaptation over the summer months, then maybe trying to maintain it
Yeah.
during September, October, before your goal race in October or November. I think there would be a benefit there. Would you recommend that?
100%. If you can, I mean, that would be the goal. And I mean, Dwayne, you know this better than me. The human body is pretty smart. If it doesn't need something, it usually will not keep it. Muscles are a great example, right? Like muscles are really great for us. It's one of those metrics, lean muscle mass or grip strength, that is a marker for health span, basically. But if we don't load muscles, they will go away. Your body knows that keeping muscle is an expensive endeavor, so why keep it? You can say the same thing about our aerobic machine. We are these aerobic creatures. We can develop this aerobic fitness, but if we don't stress it, our body will not maintain it. It's just there's no reason to do that. The same with some of these thermoregulation and heat acclimation mechanisms we have in place. They're expensive to have, and it is if we're always at 71 degrees, there's no reason your body would need any of this. So I don't know if that makes any sense. And then of course, maintaining something like we mentioned is much easier than losing something and accumulating it again, right? So, so if you can get acclimated, I know in Connecticut it probably starts cooling off by September, but like let's say by August you're pretty acclimated to the heat. Then try to maintain it any way you can. I like your idea of, if worst case, the only thing you have is a non-ventilated gym with a treadmill and some layers of clothes, you're going to be better off. Now, of course, if you have sauna, that might be a little bit better. And then there's many different levels you can take it to. But again, try to maintain as much as you can. Because I don't know about you, but it seems like the trend is all of these races are getting warmer and hotter, and it's
a planet issue, right?
Yeah, whatever your views are, we can all agree it's getting warmer, and certainly it's to be expected. I think that you're going to look at the temperature of your race and go, man, that's a lot warmer than I wanted it to be. So all you can really do is be acclimated and ready to go. And I'm telling you, losing 4 minutes in a marathon versus losing 25 minutes, oh my God, that is such a big difference.
Right.
That
Absolutely.
is so important on so mane levels. From your motivation to continue training to, your feelings on how your training went, all of those things. And it's again, just thermoregulation.
Yeah. And you mentioned sauna a couple of times. And so would that be the recommended modality of choice, like a dry sauna versus a steam room, for instance, if you were working on heat acclimation?
So that's a really good question. So the studies have all, most of the studies, I should say, are with dry saunas. Does not mean infrared sauna and wet saunas are any worse. It's just we don't have a lot of robust studies on that. The cool thing I think is that sure, heat training, going out there and running in the heat is one thing, but your body generally doesn't know the difference between passive heat exposure and active heat exposure. And passive heat exposure is extremely safe. But yeah, absolutely, you're going to trick your body into getting all of the same physiological adaptations, such as the plasma volume and stroke volume and core body temperature changes, increased sweat rate, dilute sweat, all of those things from just passive exposure to the heat. Again, the duration, usually it's about 20 to 30 minutes of sauna exposure, especially if you can do it after a run, is really great. Anything more than that is probably not very helpful. And most dry saunas are about 180 degrees Fahrenheit and, very dry. And so the advantage of that is you're sweating and evaporating. So, yeah, absolutely. I think if you can expose yourself to the sauna, that's great. As far as just this specific area, we're talking about heat acclimation. I know there's a lot of stuff out there about like saunas do this and that. I don't really talk about any of that, but as far as just sauna exposure and heat acclimation, there's definitely a decent amount of evidence.
Okay. And from what I learned earlier from you, I would say if someone did choose more the steam room version, they would probably need to hydrate even more, right? Because the droplets around there, it's going to be hard for their bodies to cool even more so, right? Like there's more of a risk of them becoming too overheated, essentially?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's actually a protocol. I wouldn't recommend this, but for very advanced sort of folks, again, world class athletes, sometimes what they do is they go into a dry sauna, get their core body temperature to a certain amount where they can basically not tolerate it anymore. And they're not hydrating. Again, I don't recommend any of this.
Right.
They're not hydrating. And then they're going into a wet sauna where again your sweat is not evaporating, so your core body temperature goes even a little bit higher, and then you're getting that extra heat load. Again, not the safest thing to do, and might be beyond the scope of this, but that is actually a strategy that some athletes use, going from dry to wet. But you're absolutely right. You're not evaporating as much, and even though the air temperature in a wet sauna is lower, over time, you are not going to be able to cool as well. So your core body temperature will rise a little bit higher. So yeah.
Okay.
But again, if you only have exposure to a wet sauna, that's still really good. I would still use it,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So we kind of covered like a beginner starting out with heat acclimation. How about for someone who is more in the intermediate phase?
Yeah. So intermediate phase, I would say basically just increase the duration and intensity, slowly lengthen the duration, maybe raise the intensity of the heat exposure. And, again, maybe kind of err on the side of a little bit longer runs if you can tolerate it. Like if you can do an hour long run in the heat, I think you're in the intermediate category. Again, there's a lot of variability with this. I think there's, not one way to actually do this. There's multiple ways. And then again, inducing some of those sauna sessions, if you have it, again, you're going to get that passive heat load, heat stress without as much of the mechanical stress. If you can do that, that would be ideal. And then for the advanced category, what you're trying to do is maybe incorporate some of the high intensity training in hot conditions to kind of push your heat tolerance a little bit more. And then, I'll kind of twist this around and ask you, I personally think that, so again, if you're an advanced runner, you're trying to maybe run a marathon at a certain time. Let's say like you're trying to hit this metric, 3 hours. It's very important. And I think to hit these high intensity runs, you want that leg turnover, you want that lactate kind of clearance effects, and all these other things. You're the coach, you can better talk about this. But when it's really hot, you're not going to be able to hit these high intensity efforts as well. So perhaps I would maybe separate those. I don't know how you feel about that, Duane, but I would maybe get your heat load, become very heat acclimated, but also be mindful of the fact that you need to hit these faster interval sessions in order to accomplish the goal you're trying to accomplish as far as time. And you might have to do those in the earlier part of the day, in the cooler parts of the day, or even indoor, in order to get that leg turnover and all these other physiological adaptations we need. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree 100%, honestly. And it is one of the most common mistakes that most runners make is they don't change that, and they want to hit, whatever their threshold pace is. And they're like, I need to hit this number, whether it's 7 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever, right? And they're trying to hit that, and they're not adjusting to the conditions outside. And, they wind up overtraining or opening themselves up to injury risk, because now their effort level was actually higher than it should have been for the goal of that intended run for that day. So yeah, I would totally agree that if it is where you're really trying to get those legs turning over at a faster rate, and you're trying to, whether, the physiologic benefit of running at a certain pace, and even the mind benefit of knowing, hey, I can hold, this pace for 2 minutes, let's say it was, or I'll take the run I did yesterday. It was a long run with 2-mile repeats at my half marathon pace, right? Like the mental benefit of me being able to run my half marathon pace for 2 miles, for 2 reps within a long run is like, okay, I was able to handle that. Whereas if it was, really hot and humid conditions and I'm trying to force the issue
Yeah.
or not hit the paces that I think I'm supposed to be hitting, right? Mentally, I'm going to be like, oh, am I going to be able to hold that for race day? So I think focusing on definitely the
Yeah.
easy run makes the most sense. The shorter runs, starting out with those and then increasing the duration and the time and waiting until you are more advanced at heat acclimation and you've played around with this in training
Yeah.
before and it's not your first rodeo. Then I would see getting into some of the faster sessions, the speed work,
Yeah.
and or your long runs, and exposing that. And that's why we recommend for our athletes, like in the summertime, like you got to get out there super early. And
Yeah.
our Floridian runners, it's kind of like they're out there before the sun rises. You have to.
Yeah.
Honestly, they're getting out there 4 a.m.,
Yeah.
5 a.m. to get their long runs in, because once that sun comes up in the summertime, it's brutal.
Yeah. No,
You know that in Texas.
yeah, no, I'm with you, man, and that's why I wanted to ask you. I'm not a coach, and so it's great to have people like you, shed some expert opinion on this, because again, again, if you're trying to complete a marathon, that's an awesome goal. I really respect that. Then you're trying to get good at endurance and jogging. But if you're trying to hit a certain metric, you're trying to, BQ, you're trying to hit a sub-3 marathon, you need that leg turnover. You need again, you got to be able to clear that lactate. All of this, the physiology. You need that capillary density. You need that mitochondrial development. You need all of those things where, again, going and jogging at, let's say, at a 7:40 pace in the heat all the time, even if you're doing a 22 miler, that's great. I mean, you're going to become really fit and you can run, really far and long in the heat at a 7:40 pace. But then you go to your fall race and you're trying to hit a 6:50 pace. You might not be able to do that, even though you're extremely fit and acclimated to the heat. So I just want people to kind of be aware of that. If you are an advanced runner and you're trying to hit these paces, I do think it's important to kind of get those intensity sessions any way you can. And that's kind of the challenge, I think, in Texas. When you have a fall race, it's always hot. So even 4 or 5 in the morning, it's still hot. So your marathon pace, especially, well, if you can hit the marathon pace at, a dew point of 80, then maybe it's not your marathon pace if you go to Chicago and the temperature is perfect, right?
Right.
So yeah, I definitely think that I agree with you 100%. If you're trying to hit a certain time for a marathon, you need to hit these paces. It's very important to kind of do those high intensity sessions. If all you have is the heat, then I don't know, Duane. Early morning. I don't like running on long runs on a treadmill, but maybe inside. I don't know, but you have to kind of hit those high intensity sessions and do them correctly. And you might not be able to do that in the heat, no matter how acclimated you are.
Yeah, and we kind of touched upon this before, just briefly, but do you have anything to add to the role of like clothing plays in heat acclimation training?
Yeah, I mean, clothing is very important. I think also kind of related to clothing is that, that race morning is trying to forecast what it's going to feel like for you, especially a mile 20 or 21 after you've conquered Heartbreak Hill. What is your body going to be going through? So I think some things to kind of think about is the radiant temperature, the humidity level. Generally, moisture wicking fabrics are the way to go, because they help pull sweat away from your skin for quicker evaporation. Again, remember how we cool off. It's actually kind of interesting. I was reading something, long sleeve versus short sleeve. You'd be a little surprised that it doesn't matter as much as the type of fabric and how close it is to your skin. So certainly light colors, reflect sunlight. We all know that. We learned that in physics, and retain less heat. So light colors, kind of a no-brainer. Darker, especially if it's sunny. Like you get a sunny Boston, I probably would not wear all black. If it's cloudy and humid, it probably matters a little bit less. If you really want that, your team tank that's black, then that's fine. But if it's, if you got that sun on you, again, it's a little misleading. The sun is a little misleading because, again, the temperature could be 65. The air temperature is fine. And the dew point could be great. It could be 45. So, 65 air temperature, dew point of 45. I think that's probably what the start of the Boston Marathon was. But a lot of people are like semi-comfortable in that temperature, but then they're not factoring in that they are going to get about 2.5, 3 hours of direct sunlight. Whereas if it was cloudy, it might be a completely different experience. And so I think just at the very beginning of the race, kind of being aware of all of that is very important. Is what is the state going to feel like? And certainly moisture wicking fabrics, light colors, those are very important. Yeah.
Okay.
Don't forget your sunscreen.
No. Absolutely. And
yeah,
I could definitely talk to you about this topic forever. But as we come down the final stretch here, which is always the last question that we ask all our guests, if you can change one thing about the misconception of heat adaptation or acclimation, what would that be?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, I would say number one, from a safety mechanism, is we do not get better acclimated to a dehydration. We need to stay hydrated. The more acclimated we are, I think there's a misconception that for some reason we need less fluids. 100% correct. In fact, we need more fluids. That's number one. Number two, I would say, is that all humans can become acclimated to the heat. This is what we do as a species. We are so good at thermoregulation in the heats, and we can all improve. There's certainly a lot of advantageous, things that we can gain from doing this. So I would say that we can all become better acclimated, and again, just be very mindful of your hydration status. Those are kind of that would be my answer, Duane. I kind of butchered it up a little bit at the end.
No, not at all. I think those are great safety points as well. If someone wants to learn more about this, how can they connect with you, Monty?
Yeah, man. I'll give you my email. You can put it in your show notes. Adaptation by Fire is our podcast. We're on all the social medias. I'm on Strava. Reach out to us. Love to hear from you.
Awesome. And this has been so enlightening. I've loved the conversation. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to come on and educate our audience. I'm looking forward to putting some of these strategies into place this summer and hopefully into my fall marathon. So I appreciate you for coming on, and I appreciate you, the listener, for you guys listening to this. So if this has been helpful for you, copy the link wherever you're listening, share it with a running friend of yours. And as always, let's maintain a strong mind, a strong body, and let's just keep on running. Until next time.